Hello, friends. Today I am joined by Jamie Erickson. When she's not curating memories, hoarding vintage books, or homeschooling her 5 kids, Jamie can be found encouraging and equipping a growing tribe of mothers all across the globe on the Mom to Mom podcast, through her blog, The Unlikely Homeschool, at national conferences, and in her books. Homeschool Bravely, How to Squash Doubt, Trust God, and Teach Your Child with Confidence, and her new book, Holy Huga. Jamie, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, after reading the official bios, I always love to give guests a chance to just introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and how you got started homeschooling.
Well, as you had said, I am married. I've been married to my college sweetheart for 20 years, and we do have 5 kids. We actually launched our first about 2 years ago, and we still currently have 2 in high school, 1 in middle school, and 1 little caboose in elementary school that keeps us really busy. He's quite the extrovert. And we got started homeschooling because my husband was homeschooled back in the 80s and 90s. I was a trained teacher in the classroom when we got married, and I had absolutely no idea that I would ever homeschool. It wasn't on my radar. I would actually say I didn't want to homeschool. I mean, who even does that? That's so weird. But all the things that you say, sometimes even before you have kids, it's interesting how, you can make your plans, but the Lord will direct your steps. So that's kind of how I fell into it. I was really challenged by my mother-in-law to consider homeschooling. And it really wasn't until I had my first child that I was like, I think I might consider it. I remembered what it was like in the classroom, and I kind of got to see the underbelly of what the school system is like. And I knew that while I don't regret that experience, and I know that it's a needed thing, and I'm grateful that we have free public education for those who need it, I knew that I wanted something different for my kids.
Oh, I love to hear your story. I didn't realize that your husband is a second generation homeschooler. I am
Yeah.
as well. I was homeschooled through graduation, and then my husband was homeschooled up through the 7th grade. So at least we both kind of came in with some background, some experience. We had both had a positive experience. And so I can imagine it would be a little bit potentially more tricky if one of you had had past homeschool experience and the other had not. But
Yeah.
how did that then play out as you kind of thought, well, maybe I'll give this a try? How did your approach to home education kind of grow and change over the years?
Well, I started out really eclectic from the very beginning. I've always thought that, every homeschool curriculum is great, but it's really only great for certain subjects or for certain kids. So I've always sort of piecemealed together a random collection of things for, my kids. I think what has changed over the years is I've really learned to let go a lot. Because I was a trained teacher, you kind of naturally take on a certain mindset of what you think education is supposed to be. You're sort of conditioned to believe learning can only look one way, sitting at a desk, facing the front, the teacher's at the front, the big talking head giving out, dispersing all the information. And really that's just school. That has very little to do with real learning and real education. So I kind of had to unlearn how to teach and find out what real learning was. And so I began to let go of a lot of things that at one time I thought were so important. And I also think that I have learned to allow non-traditional forms of learning to count. I think as moms, we think that it has to look formal. It has to be measurable. It has to be documentable to count. But real learning can look a lot of different ways. And if we're inspiring our kids to be lifelong learners, they're really learning all the time through many different mediums. And that really is true learning when your everyday life and your school life run parallel to each other, and you really have a one piece life.
Yeah, and so much of what we're teaching and learning is, like you were saying, it's not measurable, but it's the things that actually are most important for being a human, right? For growing into adulthood. And those character issues, those parenting things, a lot of times can come to the fore in ways that we don't expect. And you can't like write that on the list, like we did this many math problems necessarily in that 30-minute time. But those are the things that are going to matter long term, is really important with our kids. Yeah.
And even some of the things that are measurable. For instance, I just did a whole Civil War history unit with my 3 youngest. That's measurable. I could make up a test and drill them on the facts, but a test isn't real learning. It's just a regurgitation of what has been learned. You actually don't learn anything new in a test. And I think so often we spend so much time on these school skills because we think that's school. And it is school, but it's not actually education. So, sometimes the learning is measurable, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to measure it.
Yeah. Well, you brought up this difference between school and education. I think that is a gift that we have in homeschooling. Are there any other kind of parts of homeschooling that are some of your favorite things?
Well, I am a lifelong learner myself. I've always been a curious person. I have learned to be a beginner my whole life. And it's wonderful to be a beginner right alongside my kids and to sort of, homeschooling has been the re-education of myself. And that's been wonderful to be able to do that right alongside them. I love the fact that as a homeschooler, we get to set our own schedule, recognizing that we have 24 hours at our disposal to learn all the things. We don't have to follow the 9 to 3 marching orders of somebody else's drum. They're beating that drum down the street, but we don't have to march to it. My husband and I both work from home, and we like to adventure on the school days. And so because we homeschool, we can bring all our kids along, and it doesn't have to upset everything. We don't have to play a lot of catch up. And I really value the fact that in homeschooling, I can be a proactive parent, not a reactive one. Like I said, I did get to see a lot of the underbelly of the traditional way, the agenda, the negative worldview influences, the lack of insight that some parents have to their kids because they have so few hours with them. And the crushing of personalities and passions in kids. I got to see all of those things, up close and personal was when I was in the classroom. And in homeschooling, I not only get to avoid many, if not all of those things, but I can spend my time proactively influencing them in, my worldview. I don't have to retrain ideologies and philosophies. It's a lot harder to retrain than it is to train. So I appreciate the fact that through homeschooling, everything that I do can be very proactive.
And I think it's so valuable too, because as homeschoolers, we're able to show that these subjects don't come in these little boxes, right?
Yes.
This isn't like the history and the science and then the faith or the Bible, the theology is as if they're separate subjects. We're really able to see how all of these things integrate together so beautifully in the world around us. And so that's why a lot of times you have overlap in the subjects you're studying just naturally because you're making those connections. It's really exciting.
Yeah, connecting the dots, very cross-curricular learning. Really tapping into the whole person, the holistic being, their physical self, their spiritual self, their emotional self, their mental self. It all just gets to be integrated across the curriculum.
Well, these are all some of the real gifts that homeschooling gives us, but it can come with a lot of challenges too. Sometimes the very things that make it so wonderful, like being with our children and seeing them as whole people, not just talking about their academics. Sometimes those very good things can also be the challenges. So have there been any challenges you have faced in homeschooling? And then how have you sought to overcome those difficulties?
Well, I can think of two right out off the bat. First and foremost, I've always had an allergy to math. Math and I do not get along. We don't play nicely. We haven't my entire life. And so in the early years, I was really fearful about homeschooling in the upper grades, knowing, like I can add, I can subtract, even do long division, although I'd rather, eat a bag of hair than do long division if I could choose. But I knew that my kids would need some of that upper level math. And so that was a real fear that I had. But I have learned in the years that I don't actually have to teach all the things to count myself as a homeschooler. Homeschooling just means that I get to decide who teaches the thing, when it's taught, how it's taught, where it's taught, and with what, what resources it's taught. That's still homeschooling. So I have learned over the years to give myself the blessing and the gift of farming out math to people who know it better, love it more, and can teach it appropriately on the upper levels. And I don't feel the least bit guilty about that, because it certainly makes my kids understand it more and enjoy it more. And it helps to strengthen our relationship too. We don't have to allow math, to be the big elephant in the room. We don't have to strong arm each other during math time. So I can still be mom, the cheerleader. So that's the first one. And I think the second struggle has been, I do have one child who is dyslexic. I won't say severely, but pretty dyslexic. And so learning has been a struggle for him. And every single victory has been hard won. But we've been homeschooling long enough that I can see how, through some of that struggle, he has learned perseverance. He has learned faithfulness. He has learned, stick-to-itiveness and determination, all these character qualities that would have probably been missed had some of the learning not been a struggle. And he hopes to join the military someday. He's not far away from that. He actually hopes to be a Navy SEAL. And I can't think of a more useful skill than perseverance and stick-to-itiveness and faithfulness for a Navy SEAL. God knew exactly what this child needed. And he has used even this child's struggle to form him into exactly the person he needs to be able to do the will of God in his life. And so that has been a struggle, but it's certainly not one that is one I'd wish away.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I think sometimes when we think about the challenges either that we're facing as homeschool parents, or we see a challenge our child is facing, and we can just sort of define possibly the whole homeschool year, or our homeschool quote unquote success, whatever that means, right? Or their future goals and things. We could kind of define it by the challenge, instead of seeing this challenge as something that is hard. We don't have to be like, it's all fine, kind of in a fake way, but to see it as a gift. What are we going to learn through this challenge that God can use in the future? And I think that's such a beautiful way to reframe it, because it is a gift. It is on purpose from a good God who loves us and knows us best and knows our children best. And so to be able to see that as a potential for growth, instead of just something that's a drudgery, I think is a really great perspective.
Then I think the other thing that we need to remember is if our kids have a struggle, specifically a learning struggle, an academic struggle, they would still have those struggles down the street at a brick and mortar school. But in addition to that, they would have some of the social pressures and anxiety that comes from having a struggle in a peer-driven situation, in a situation where not everyone around you has your best interest in mind. So then you take that struggle and you sort of add on the burden of some of those social pressures and anxieties. And so I hope that that's encouraging to a mom who has a child with a learning struggle, that, the public school will say your child needs an IEP, an individual education plan, but through homeschooling, every single child gets an IEP. And so over the years, I've been able to tailor make an education for my son who does struggle, and be able to alleviate and mitigate some of those struggles in ways that continue to allow him to learn in the best way that he can.
I have a few interviews back in the podcast feed of people who have come on and really addressed some of these issues of learning challenges and learning difficulties, and have given some great advice and encouragement that I've been able to use with my own children, and I know will be an encouragement to many others. So I will put those in the links of the show notes for this episode. But one of the challenges I think that we can sometimes face, at least maybe I should just say I have sometimes faced it, is occasionally, I know it's hard to imagine, but my children don't always obey. They're not always respectful. Some days even though I'm a homeschool mom and I'm writing about homeschooling, I was homeschool myself. I love it. Sometimes I don't really necessarily want to be with that particular kid on that particular day. It can just seem like it would be so much easier. It would solve all our problems if they were just out of the picture. But I know that's not really true, right? So what would be your encouragement to a mom who's maybe feeling that pressure of if the child just weren't homeschooled, if they were just out of the house, we wouldn't have these struggles?
Yeah, I think you just gave the resume of 107% of homeschool moms. Like I don't know of a homeschool mom who doesn't have a difficult child. And difficult is a very general, loose term that can mean a lot of things. And sometimes it could just mean, you have personalities that clash at times, or maybe you have personalities like in the case of my daughter and I, and she wouldn't regret that I mentioned this. She and I have such similar personalities that through the years, that was sometimes a struggle. So yeah, we all have that one child. But I guess my answer would be you aren't really addressing the issue by sending them off to a public school. You're just merely putting duct tape over it. But it might be a quick fix that alleviates the struggle for the short term, but eventually that struggle as that child gets older and matures and gets physically bigger, emotionally larger, that struggle is going to get larger too if it's not dealt with. You can't just put a Band-Aid over a struggle. And so they'll bring that struggle home with them. And you will end up in the evening and in the weekend with that struggle, still not really being able to address it, because character struggles take time. Personality bents take effort. You have to lean into that as a mom. You have to do the hard work. So I think many times when kids are just sent off to the public school, all of those struggles get exacerbated because of, like we had mentioned before, some of those social pressures, being in a peer environment, being in an overstimulating environment. If you, on the other hand, were to keep them at home in the greenhouse of your home, I can guarantee you that some of the days will be really, really hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. But hard is not necessarily bad. Think about all the things that are hard in our lives. Marriage can be hard. A career can be hard. Having children can be hard. But most of the hard things in life are actually the most worthwhile things. It just requires some effort. So I guess I would say there's something about you that God knew, something about you and your personality that God knew that child needed. And that's why God gave you that child. But there's also something about you or them and their personality that God knew you needed too. And he put you together on purpose. And so while it would be really easy to just, wave the white flag and send them off somewhere else to let someone else do the work, that work is yours to do. And it takes time and it takes an investment. And that time and investment cannot happen if it cannot happen deeply if you send them off for somebody else to do the work.
I think a lot of times the difficulty can come when we've put our hope into the homeschooling. Like that's
Yes.
the foundation for our hope, because we have this idea, well, if I just homeschool, then my children will always obey and will always be happy and everything will turn out just fine because homeschooling will save my children. And that is not the way life works, right? Homeschooling won't save your children. You need the Holy Spirit for that,
Right.
to work in their hearts. And so when we shift our identity onto, well, this method of home education as the thing that will make everything happy all the time, and then things are sometimes hard, or we're not just having this blissful day with unicorns and rainbows every morning, with our kids, then we're thinking, well, is this the wrong choice? Am I doing something wrong? And there may be things we need to repent of and certainly be sanctified in that. But a lot of times it's just in that hard that God's doing the hard work of changing our hearts and of changing our children's hearts. And I think it does no one any good to sugarcoat and have this sort of idealized view of homeschooling that everyone's always happy and your children are always well behaved.
I actually think it does the opposite. When you are in a house for, 10 to 12 hours a day with somebody, it actually brings to light all of the brokenness that is already there. But that's a good thing. We can't see that as a bad thing, because those issues can never be addressed if they're just shoved under the rug. You can shove all kinds of issues under a rug, but eventually you're going to trip over that big mound that's under the rug. It has to be addressed. So actually, homeschooling brings so much of our brokenness. We're imperfect people in an imperfect world, raising imperfect kids. Homeschooling actually allows some of those things to come to light. But I agree, homeschooling is not the salvation of anybody. And I would also say it's a real naive posture to take, to assume that homeschooling is only going to be, unicorns and rainbows, because homeschooling has its own share of struggles and its own share of strengths. And in choosing homeschool, you're actually saying, these are the struggles and strengths that God wants me and my kids to have. And I think, no matter what educational choice you choose, you're going to have struggles and strengths, but we'd all do well to prayerfully consider, Lord, what are you going to use in my life and in my kids' lives to refine us and make us into the more completed us, the more us that looks like you? And for some of us, that's going to be homeschooling.
Yeah, I like to say that homeschooling is the best hard thing that I do.
Yes. One of the best, for sure.
Definitely. Well, I think that a lot of us can come into homeschooling with a lot of fear and anxiety, or maybe even a fear of homeschooling that is keeping a mom from considering it. So why do you think fear just can sort of bind us up as we think about homeschooling? And are those fears valid?
Well, I think the easiest answer to that is just that that's not our lived experience. I mean, most of us didn't homeschool. And so our experience is a traditional model. That's what we know. And anytime we have something unknown or new, there is an element of fear to it. And so, when you're stepping into unknown territory, you can often feel like a pioneer. Now, I would not say that anybody homeschooling right now is a pioneer, but you're a pioneer in your home, just stepping out, doing it for the first time. If you are a first generation homeschooler, and that's going to bring some element of fear. I also think that our culture places too high a value on certifications, like teaching degrees. And moms think that, if I don't have a bunch of letters behind my name, if I don't have a piece of official paper that says I'm a trained teacher, and the government has stamped their sanction on my abilities, then who are we to say we can educate a child? And I also think that mothering itself comes with a certain amount of fears. Any mother can tell you a lengthy list of fears she has for her kids, but then you add the overwhelming, or sometimes overwhelming, responsibility of educating that child on top of all those regular mothering fears. And then those fears just become, ballooned. I think that while it's natural and normal to have some of those fears, I don't really think that there's any relevance or grounding for them. I think that's just the tool of the enemy to try to get you to not homeschool. We know that homeschoolers score, on average, in the 87th percentile of normative tests, despite the fact that most families are on a limited budget. They don't have $1 billion budget at their disposal to buy all the educational must-haves, despite the fact that most homeschooling moms don't have a certification in teaching, despite the fact that, they have lots of apprehensions to know how to do it right. Homeschooling and homeschoolers are far excelling in academics. That's just the nuts and bolts. That's the black and white facts of it. And I think that some of our fears can be alleviated by looking to, like you and my husband and all these other second generation homeschoolers who are regular contributing members of society, who are passionately involved in their communities and in their workplaces. They walk out civic responsibility in front of everyone. Like 10, 20 years ago, when my mother-in-law was homeschooling, and she was one of the pioneers, her fears maybe were a little bit more palatable or easier to understand, because there wasn't a proof that this thing was going to work out. It was a grand experiment. But we're beyond the experiment phase now. We have a whole generation of grown adults who are proof that this thing works. So you might not be able to homeschool perfectly. None of us can. But God is able to orchestrate the perfect homeschool for you and your kids. Not a perfect one, mind you. Hear me. It's the one that is perfect for you and your kids. And that will include struggles, because that's part and parcel for living on this side of the garden. But if we let him, God will lead our homeschooling day and it will be perfect. And then someday our kids will be the proof that it works.
Yeah. I love the way you emphasized that it's the perfect homeschool for your family, not the perfect homeschool, because I think a lot of times we can look at one particular family or this example and the other, and we think our family has to look just that way. And if we don't look just that way, then somehow we aren't living up to some imaginary ideal. And that's just not the case. That's one of the gifts of homeschooling, in fact, that we can find what's going to work best for our own unique families. And I think it's so valuable to listen to the stories of the people who really did go in that first generation and figure all this stuff out. I joked they were like doing it without the internet. How did they homeschool before the internet? So we actually did a special Homeschool Generations series where I interviewed a bunch of homeschool parents from my mom's generation, got their stories and the things they learned. I interviewed then a bunch of other second generation homeschoolers and sort of our experience and how that's playing into our homeschools now. So I think that's really encouraging just to hear, like, we may not know how to pronounce words correctly because we read we learned our vocabulary from reading. So sometimes I'll still come out with a word that's mispronounced, but that's okay,
Well, and I can tell you that as a teacher in the classroom, I had plenty of kids who really struggled to spell because they were taught to say words incorrectly based on their dialect of where they were from. So it's not just a homeschool problem.
It's not just a homeschool problem. Okay, good. Well, okay, so we have this sort of fear of homeschooling as maybe being too scary. We've sort of alleviated that one. But what about the mom who's like, I think homeschooling sounds great. It doesn't sound scary. I just am already overwhelmed. I feel like I'm not even doing a good job just all the other mom and life and keeping the house running stuff I'm supposed to be doing. So how is that mom supposed to now add home educating to her list of to-dos?
Well, I think first and foremost, you can't borrow trouble. I did that in my early years. I looked ahead to the years I'd be having to teach upper math skills. I wasn't there yet. In the same way that I can't fear having baby number 5 when I'm only on baby number 1. God will give you exactly what you need when you need it. And I think sometimes that really is the struggle with moms. It's not our overwhelming busyness. It's we look at the busyness that we have right now and we add in all this other busyness that we think is going to come, not realizing that, your kids grow with you. And so your busyness will change and will ebb and flow. I think also many moms who've started out in the public school and have transitioned to homeschooling will confess to actually being less busy. And the busy that they do have in their lives of homeschooling is actually a busyness of their own choosing. And what I mean by that, when you have kids in the public school, you think, oh, somebody else is teaching them. And then they come home. But what happens when they come home is you're doing homework with them for hours after school. And this is homework at the end of the day when you are tired and you are spent, you have no more gas in the tank. You are having to tutor to someone else's teaching style and ways of teaching, like Common Core math. I didn't learn Common Core math. If I had to teach it, I'd be like, hard pass. This is how I do math. And to be able to, or to have to tutor someone in that would be painstaking for me. So you're having to teach to somebody else's standards. I think that you're having to come into a subject like right in the middle of the subject. You're not sort of ramping up to it and learning right alongside your kids. So oftentimes that busyness is a different kind of busyness when you have your kids in the public school versus if you're teaching your kids, you get them at the very best part of the day and they get you at the very best part of the day. You're actually proactively teaching and not having to reactively retrain. You get to teach them, regular old math or whatever it is you want to teach versus the way somebody else is wanting them to learn. And you get to have a long runway of learning right alongside them. You get to start out with the basic fact and add on to the next fact. You're not just thrown into the deep end, having to remember all of these things that it's been years since you've learned. So I think sometimes we can look at homeschooling and think, I can't do that. That will make me so much more busy than I already am now. I would argue that it's the opposite. It's when you have your kids in school and you're like racing out the door to get them to school or to pick them up from after school activities, bundling up all of your younger ones, waking them up from naps to, go pick up your older ones, whatever, all the chaos that happens when you have to live half of your life outside of your house. I think that's a different kind of busy, and it's a busy of not your choosing.
There's something very powerful about getting to choose your own busy, right? The
Right.
things that are your family's priorities are the things then you're going to choose to invest your time on. It's a lot harder if someone else is telling you, no, I don't really care about your priorities. You got to do things my way.
Right. And just the fact that you're expelling so much energy retraining your kids at the end of the day, it really does require so much more effort and energy to retrain than it does to train.
Jamie, this has been so encouraging already. So many tidbits moms can take away. But I'm always curious when I talk to moms who have been homeschooling for a while, especially moms who have graduated a student. What do you wish you could go back and tell your new homeschool mom self? Like, what advice would you give to yourself?
That's such a great question. I wish I could do that, actually. And I would say to my younger Jamie, pick the fun curriculum. In those early years when I was starting out, and most of my decision making came from the fact that I was conditioned as a trained teacher to believe, school had to look one way. I didn't pick the fun curriculum. I chose the rigorous curriculum because, oh, she's in kindergarten. It has to count. It has to be meaningful. She'll get far behind. You know what? I've been doing this long enough to know that I should have picked the fun curriculum because all of that rigor will come. You have such a short window to be able to not just do the fun things, but to be able to have kids young enough to want to do those fun things with you, because when they get to the teen years, they're kind of past all the unit studies and the messy projects and all the fun things that make homeschooling so enchanting. So I guess I would love to go back and tell the younger Jamie, just reach for the fun curriculum. Studies show that apart from math, which is more systematic, you have to learn one skill on top of another skill on top of another skill. Apart from math, every other subject can actually be learned and learned well in the last 3 or 4 years of your homeschool. So you might say, oh, well, she's in first grade. It has to count. If you don't do a single thing, now this isn't licensed to just, throw your hands up and be a lazy homeschool mom, but hopefully this will ease us all back a little bit and dial back the angst and the fear. If you don't do a single thing from first grade all the way till, say, high school, they'll still be okay. I am a published author right now, and I didn't learn a stitch of grammar. I didn't know what a noun or a verb was. I didn't know how to write a proper sentence until I was in the 7th grade. But I learned it when I needed it. So I guess I would just say, Jamie, dial back the angst and just reach for the fun.
And with that fun, you can't, it's a lot harder. I shouldn't say you can't, but it's a lot harder to teach that wonder, that delight,
Yes.
that
The
excitement, that love
enchantment.
for learning. Yes, the enchantment. It's a lot harder to teach that later than it is when they're already primed to just think anything you learn and explore is fun when they're little, right?
That's
So
right.
to build that, to grow that love of learning is going to be invaluable later on than when they have to, go a little deeper into whatever
That's
areas
right.
they need to study.
Yeah, you've already primed the pump and you've pointed their feet in a good direction. And then when you have established enchantment and delight, man, they will learn it with or without you.
Yes. And sometimes it's really interesting the things my older kids have just discovered that they're interested in. I'm like, well, look at you figuring that out yourself, watching the
Yep.
YouTube videos, reading the books. It's really fun to see them coming into their own as unique people. So,
Yep. Absolutely.
well, here at the end, I'm going to ask you the questions that I ask all of my guests. And the first one is just, what are you personally reading lately?
I'm reading three different things. I will give them to you really quickly, the Cliff Notes. I'm reading a book called The Pagan Church, which just talks about the pagan roots of so many of our American church practices. And in light of that, what are we to do with that as 21st century American Christians? What are we to do with that knowledge? And then I am reading a book called I Will Always Write Back. And that is it's a true memoir about two middle schoolers. One was an American white girl, and one was a boy in Zimbabwe, and they were paired up as pen pals in middle school. And it's the story of how their life absolutely changed with just the passing back and forth of letters, getting to know each other's perspectives and lived experiences, getting to build in each other an empathy and an understanding. It's a really great book. And then I am listening to a book called Listen to the Moon. It's a middle grade fiction, kind of lower end of YA. I lead a tween and teen book club for my son and his friends. So that happens to be the book that we're reading. And it is about a girl who was shipwrecked when the Lusitania sunk in World War II. And she was shipwrecked on the coast of a very small British village. And through a series of circumstances, everybody in that village thinks she is a German. And so it's sort of the unraveling of all of those things in this young girl's life.
Oh, wow. All three of those sounds really fascinating. I'm going to have to see if my library has any of those. Yeah.
Highly recommend them. Yeah.
Well, the final question I have for you is, what is your best tip for helping the homeschool day run more smoothly?
Definitely establish good habits. Establish a rhythm to your day, not necessarily a set schedule, like, at 8 o'clock, we're going to do this, and then 8:30, we're going to do that, but just a rhythm, a routine to your day. Establishing where you're going to store things. What do your kids do when mom has to be called away to do something apart from homeschooling, like throw in a load of laundry or just like be a real human being for a second? What are they going to do when they're all done with their school and, they have some free time? Just establishing those rhythms and routines, establishing good habits will really set the course of your homeschool day. And then if things go off the rails, as they do, because again, we're imperfect people living in an imperfect world, you'll be able to hop back on those rails a little bit easier because the rhythm and the routine has already been established.
Such good advice. Yes. Habits and the rhythm and routine can be so valuable, and I think are actually a lot easier to follow and to stick with than a strict timed schedule, because you're always, I don't know, I always get off a strict time schedule and then I feel behind.
Right. A routine is the grace that you need to have longevity in this. A schedule feels like someone apart from you is bossing you around, and nobody likes that. You feel restricted, and eventually you give up on the thing because you just can't do it anymore.
Jamie, this has been so wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me today. Where can people find you all around the internet?
Well, I think the easiest place is just to go to jamieerickson.com. That's where you can find my podcast and my blog and my books. And I'd love to meet you.
Yeah, I will have a link to your site in the show notes for this episode over at humilityandoxology.com. And I look forward to chatting with you again. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you so much for having me.